We will begin our joint work session, city council work session. The planning commission is here, members, and I believe DRB. So I will call to order and Wednesday, March 2nd, 2022. And I know approval of the agenda.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, before we start, we're going to have our little public comment phase. I will ask for 3 minutes as best as possible for the folks speaking. But before that even happens, I think I'd like to go around the room just so everybody's has the ability to know who their neighbors are. And then we'll go to Zoom. Zoom's kind of easy for us because you all got names on you, but we'll do it anyhow. So I'll start. I'm Sam, the mayor.
Robin Risley, council.
Brandon Ogilvy, City Council.
Alicia Blaylock, Design Review Board.
Barb Knopf, Planning Commission.
Nancy McCarthy, city council.
You just jumped over me.
We're just being a little bit hesitant there.
Mike Benefield, counselor. Mike Bates, planning commission.
Okay, might as well do staff too, just because.
Rusty Barrett IT.
Robert St. Clair, planner.
Jeff Adams, community development director.
Keith Lyden, I'm helping with the code audit project.
Excellent. So I'm going to go to the Zoom and I'll point you out. So we'll start with Lisa.
Lisa Kerr, Planning Commission.
Okay. Below Lisa is Clay
Good evening, everyone. Clay Newton. I'm on the planning commission.
and Anna or Mickey.
I'm Anna Moritz on the Planning Commission.
Dave.
I'm Dave Doring. I'm with the Design Review Board.
And Michelle.
Hi, Michelle Valagura, Design Review Board.
Good. And then we have another presenter from Herbworks, Marcy.
Hello, everyone. I'm Marcy McAnally from Herbsworks.
Great. That also proved that we all can hear each other too. So thanks to that. With that, we will jump straight to our public comment. I have 3 names listed for public comment. Again, I asked to try and keep your presentations limited, and we'll start with Tim. Trustee.
Can you hear me now?
Hi, Tim, go ahead.
Thanks so much. Pleased to have the opportunity to speak. We submitted some letters on behalf of the Protect Cannon Beach Group, and we're excited for this process to kick off. We have certain thoughts about it, and I'd like to jump into that. First, we stated we're not in favor of the idea of absolute square footage limits for the entire town. It just doesn't make sense. We've researched 20 plus cities and we can't find anybody who thinks this is best practice. They all work with floor area ratios, and that's logical. I mean, bigger lots should be allowed to have bigger houses, and that makes sense. I sent a addendum out to you today. I hope you all had a chance to take a look at it, but really this is a very concentrated set of houses. 60% of the residential properties in the city of Cannon Beach are below 5,000 square feet, and 77% are below 7,000 square feet, and talking about lot size. And I think it was 88% are below 10,000 square feet. So the tail of distribution here is pretty small. We're really talking about a whole lot of 5,000 square foot lots or smaller. We have looked at a lot of different cities. One of the models that we liked a lot was from the city of Palo Alto. CJ Hughes did this research, and essentially they gave sort of a baseline level of floor area ratio of 0.6 to the first 5,000 square feet, and then ramped it down to 0.2 for any square footage of your lot above 5,000 square feet. So that kind of provides a baseline level of house for everybody. If you followed that model, it would be quite a reduction from what is the current law. But I think it would still accomplish what the council's goals are. But further, you really have to talk about lot line setbacks. You have to talk about lot coverage ratios. We're all in favor of preserving a 50% lot coverage ratio, which gives plenty of space for green space and natural space on a lot. So I think there is really a possibility of a win-win here that I hope the council and the planning commission will consider. And, you know, I guess our view is that if you go with an arbitrary limit that really penalizes families, it penalizes remote workers, it penalizes multi-generational housing. And quite frankly, you know, I pointed out that Mr. Mayor, I think you asked us all to read the comprehensive plan, which we did at your urging. And the comprehensive plan right now says one of our three key businesses or three key activities in the city of Cannon Beach is the second home market. So I think we've got a problem with the path that the council and the planning commission has been on, because you would be in violation really of the comprehensive plan with any kind of arbitrary 2,000 or 2,500 or 3,000 or 3,500 square foot limit. So we hope you'll consider those things and consider all of the needs of all of the families, not just retirees. We understand that, you know, 70% of the residents of Cannon Beach are retirees. Well, we'd like that to change. And with remote work, people moving here with families, it can.
Thanks, Tim. Okay, we'll move on. Thank you again. Rusty, can you find who's next? Caleb.
Everyone, can you hear me okay?
Hi, Caleb, go ahead.
Hi, good evening. Sorry for the park. I'm sitting outside on the deck, catching a little bit of a break from the rain. I wanted to provide comment similar to what I wrote in. I won't go into the details there. You can read that. Do just want to say, you know, I looked back at the notes for the year plus that this has been at discussion through the various meetings of the Planning Commission and then further and looked through a lot of the testimony. And I see a very consistent trend line through this that does recognize the challenges that the community is facing. And I just want to say, like, for myself and everybody that I've been talking to as I've dug into this issue more, house size as well as affordability and livability, I think everybody does consistently agree on the challenges. And the idea of balance is the biggest issue to me. It seems like we're a little out of balance. So I hope that this process of code review will help to restore balance. My main concern is that we don't swing too far in one direction, which is what that really restrictive gross floor area restriction of 2,000 square feet really seemed like way too far of a swing the other direction. So I hope that you will keep that main idea of how do we find balance in line and a win-win for everybody, which I think really can be found in the community. One of my other thoughts, and I know you can't directly respond to this in this forum, but it would be really great to hear as this process unfolds from UrbsWorks. I read their documentation in the packet for this meeting. I thought it was excellent, good background information, and clearly they as professionals, the city's staff as professionals, and all of you on Planning Commission and City Council have put a lot of effort already and will continue to do so. So that's good faith and trust the public has put in you, and that's well placed. I'd like UrbsWorks to be able to speak to, if they can, what they see in other cities and municipalities of how they're addressing finding balance, because I think that outside expertise is really helpful. As we dig into these delicate and important matters, I think we all bring our own biases and views to the table. I've spent a lot of time hearing from other people, reading what others have to say, walking around town, looking at places, and I'd say my feelings and views have shifted a bit, to be honest, on this. More in going, yeah, there's a bigger problem than I had realized when I step back and hear from people and look with my own eyes around town. So that outside perspective is super important, and I hope that as this process unfolds, Planning Commission and Council, you will lean heavily into widening the aperture of perspective that you bring in, and that our consultants working on us and helping us with this as a city will be able to voice their expertise and what they're seeing in other areas. Thanks.
Thank you, Kev. And last we have CJ Hughes.
Can you all see and hear me okay?
All right, go ahead.
Cool. This is a fun process to join via Zoom. Thanks for letting me speak. So first off, I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm CJ Hughes. I've been working with Caleb and Tim, and I have sent quite a number of letters over the past few months as I'm just trying to get more up to speed on this discussion within Cannon Beach. But I myself am very new to both Cannon Beach, not to the Oregon coast, but to this community. So I've really appreciated the level of transparency that you all have provided, both just through this forum and obviously through all of the information that's been shared online. So I just wanted to start by saying thank you for providing that level of transparency. To the actual code audit work that's been shared from UrbsWorks, this is exactly the kind of thing that I was hoping to see as being a part of these proceedings. It's getting into the definitions, it's getting into principles. And there are some really core concepts that are coming up, and I see them being questioned in a way that is a little bit more grounded than what I saw in some of the previous conversations in January. To give an example of kind of what I'm referring to, discussion of previous comments of 3,000 square feet is too big when discussing house sizes is a very different sort of statement to make from the way it's framed in some of this work from UrbsWorks. Where it's basically saying, hey, we should look at workforce housing, or we should start to question some of the principles that go into the housing plan. So the thing that I am just really want to emphasize and excited about here is that we're starting to talk about principles, and we're starting to acknowledge that there are some bigger problems to solve than size of house. My personal preference and the thing I've actually, again, to kind of follow in Caleb's footsteps, I know you all can't comment on directly, but I would love with this group together today between the Planning Commission, UrbsWorks, and the City Council to hear a perspective on, is this issue of 2,000 square feet keeps coming back. My understanding is that in the agenda and the packet for today, the comment from Lolly in there was not part of the official meeting agenda, but it does again speak to the 2,000 square foot issue that keeps coming up. And the question I would really have for all of you as a newcomer to this community and somebody who meets all these different criteria of being able to work remotely if I choose wanting to start a family and not falling into this demographic of wanting to contribute to the second home retirement community in perpetuity is, where is this coming from? because it comes across to me as extremely unwelcoming. And I love Cannon Beach. I want to be a part of the community, but I also want to understand some of the origin of these conversations. And a lot of it seems to be rooted in these principles that are really clear to someone who's new to the community over the past couple of months. And I just really like an explanation or a better understanding of some of these principles and what are the real challenges we're trying to solve when this keeps coming up, because it does keep coming up despite talking about better tools like FAR, despite asking to look at needs of different families and recognizing that they are different. Thank you for listening to the commentary.
Great, thank you. Okay. Now, find where am I at here? Okay.
Mary Beth had a hand up.
We have a hand up? Oh, wait, Mary Beth, go ahead. Rusty, sorry, Rusty first.
Okay, I think I am live now.
Hi, Mary Beth.
Hi. I just want to weigh in on this. It is something that I've been thinking about since it first started percolating up. And I do think that there is a need for a cap on the total size of a house that can be put on a lot, just to keep things from, say, somebody buying 6 lots and putting the Taj Mahal on them, tearing down everything that's there and putting the Taj Mahal up. I think that there is a need for a limit because that's not going to maintain the village feel of our town. I do know that the Planning Commission and the Design Review Board are all working hard with the City Council to come to something that will work for everyone. And I trust in all of you to maintain the livability of Cannon Beach uppermost in your mind while you are listening to all of the arguments and going through this process. So I just want to say thank you to all of you for all of the time you're investing in this. And I know that we will come out with a good agreement that meets the needs of most. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else with their hand up, West?
Not that I see.
Okay, last call for public comment. Okay, I'm closing the public comment. We're going to go to our presentation and discussion. I guess I'll turn it right over to Jeff.
I think Marcy will lead most of this discussion, but I think she wanted Bruce to open this. Is Bruce gonna, would you like to say a few words first or?
I was not planning on it, no.
Okay. Marcy, Bruce has passed.
Bruce has passed it over to me.
But I'm happy to introduce it. I'm excited by this process. I know Bruce is excited as well. And to get to actually geek out on such terms as a lot coverage, floor area ratio, gross floor area, all those fun things that I deal with every day, other people are now going to know about these things and learn about them. And if anyone can make sense of our lot coverage definition, hey, have at it, is what I have to say. But I'm looking forward to this. I'm going to just go ahead and do you want to introduce the agenda, Marcy, and then we can get into kind of the agenda for the day?
Sure. Okay. I think I would like to start presenting, actually. The agenda's on the presentation.
So can you share your screen, Marcy?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Let me make this bigger. Can people see this? Get a thumbs up would be great. Okay, thank you. Right, so I'm going to make an introduction to the agenda, what we hope to talk about here, how we hope to hear from you this evening. And then I'm going to turn it over to Keith to give a bit more detailed description of the code audit project. Then it will come back to me again, and I will talk about the floor area ratio and all these things. So this is a list of the things we hope to discuss with you, but we're going to get through the presentation before we take comments. First of all, the code audit project officially started last year. And I want to explain that the CDO stands for the Community Development Ordinance. And the project that Keith and Herbsworks are engaged in with you is an audit of your comprehensive plan and your ordinance. However, it's not the amendments themselves. It's really a deep look into the systems and how they work together, how to address your concerns, and tell you how you might go about correcting them by amending the code. However, it's not the actual amendments. And while we go through this description of our task, this term code concepts will come up, and I just want to simplify things and explain that it's a when we use the term code concepts, we're talking about options that you have that we will present to you, that you could fix your code A or fix your code B. We'll generally provide you with a couple or three options and then welcome your discussion. We understand the issues driving this project have a lot to do with housing and the housing needs, the housing shortage. However, it's not just about housing. We will be looking at all of the areas of the code, all the areas that it covers, including the downtown. Anyway, it's a very deep, rich conversation, as people have already commented on. So I'm going to, at this point, hand it back to Keith and let him go through the code audit tasks. And Keith, if you just want to let me know when you want a slide to be shifted, I'll do that.
Okay. Just when you're ready.
Okay, there we go.
As Marcy indicated, we're looking at this project. We're looking at two basic things that we will be doing, working with you. One is to do the audit, and this would be to take a look at where the community, the conference plan and community development code maybe don't support each other as best they could, as far as the CDO maybe not implementing what's in the comprehensive plan, or maybe the comprehensive plan doesn't give you enough direction to really come up with a code that's going to work well. So it's a two-way street there as far as how that works. The comprehensive plan actually guides what you put into your codes for what you actually get as far as land use is concerned. So we'll be, I'm sorry I didn't commit these slides to memory. So so your comprehensive plan was adopted, as you know, back in 1979. You've done some amendments over time, but nothing really a very full comprehensive look at the plan to see what you might want to change. And then as far as the CDO is concerned, and we're referring here to your subdivision Title 16 and your zoning Title 17, part of the municipal code, has been adopted, of course, over time. But we're going to be taking a look at, I'm having trouble reading these slides. So anyway, just getting to what's being reviewed, we're going to be taking a look at the comprehensive plan, and then also taking a look at the subdivision and zoning part of your code. Go to the next slide, Marcy. So The project schedule. So one of the things that we've been working on some things with you already that were some amendments that went through last fall. And this project will really just take a step back and not try to be jumping to solutions yet, but really just try to identify the problems and just get a whole list so you get an idea of where things maybe aren't working as well as you would like. We would come back to discuss what our findings are when we do an audit. Now, speaking of the audit, one of the things that we would like to invite everybody to do is if you have elements of the comprehensive plan or you've noticed things in the code that you don't feel are working very well, please feel free to let us know what those are. Because one of the things that's always hard is from somebody from the outside. On the one hand, you see some things and maybe you don't because you're looking at it from a different perspective. But on the other hand, I'm not like this gentleman over here who's implementing it every day. And, there's things that you can read over and not realize what the problem is until you get that specific question. Then you have to go into the code and you look at the definitions and you look at something else and you realize this isn't quite making sense. So anything that you have come across, we really should get some kind of a system so we can get any ideas from you where you think there's some problems. Not necessarily worried about the solution right now, but just problems where you think there's some disconnects or definitions that are missing, any of that kind of stuff. After we've taken a good look at the code audit and identified the problems, then we will work with you to come up with what Marcy described as code concepts. And here, like she says, we'll just be coming up with ideas. We would describe how you might go about solving a problem. So obviously we're going to have some code concepts about size of homes, different ways you can approach that. You had some comments just now about different possible ways you could do that. So we could describe those, maybe, and also get in maybe some of the pros and cons on what you might do. But then that will give you a nice basis then for deciding how you want to amend your plan and your code. And you have some ideas about how to do that. Then your next step would be writing the specific language or the specific provisions in your code. So I guess you can think of it as a 3-step process, and we're doing the first 2 steps. Go ahead, Marcy. Yes, please. So this is just a little context you probably already understand. We have the state, Oregon statewide plan goals that govern what local governments have in their land use requirements, both in the comprehensive plan. We have revision policies, goals, and guidance for specific areas in the city like you have. And then that gives you the direction then for your code and how you actually regulate land use in the city. Go ahead, Marcy. So, okay, I see the heading got off here. So subdivision is 16.04 through 16.430 in your code. And then the rest of the sections below are different portions of the zoning code. But one of the things we did notice is a lot of the zoning codes will be broken up into articles where similar sections are put together. So for example, you would have a section that would make the Article 1 is just about procedures, how you review things, and all the different chapters would be clustered that way. Base zones, your residential zones, commercial zones, et cetera, would be another distinct group. Your code is organized sort of like that, but it's not broken into distinct areas. And sometimes that makes it, if you do have it in distinct areas, it makes the code a little easier to navigate because you know exactly where you need to, what area of the code you need to look at certain types of things. But you have everything here. So we just have an outline of the basic components of your zoning ordinance that you have today. Next slide, Marcy. So we've already taken a preliminary look at your plan and your code, and Here are just some examples of things that we have noticed that you probably will want to update statements that are made both in the content and the code, and take a look at terminology. In some cases, you probably have some references to some things that have been superseded, out of date. For example, your plan talks about planning horizon in 2000. So obviously, we might like the good old days, but we can't go back. So, you know, those would be obvious things. Another would be improved clarity and completeness of your definitions, so that, you know, most reasonable people can look at that and come to the same conclusion. You know, this would be both in the plan and in the code. So an example in your plan might be this reference to village character. And I think everybody's seen, at least based on what I've heard so far in this project, everybody seems to believe in maintaining some sort of a village or Cannon Beach character. And I think the more that you can identify what that means, and I know that's you'll never succeed completely, but the more you can give a flavor for what that means, it would really help guide what comes out of maybe the size of homes or scale of buildings or finish of buildings. You know, there'd be a lot of things there that vision statement is really important, is how it can drive some of the other things that you do later. One thing I noticed also in the plan is, and sometimes you revert to almost regulatory language in the comp plan. You'll just give a very specific standard. You know, you're going to do it this way, and it's going to be this dimension or what have you. And that's usually not something that you put in the comp plan. That's something that you say for the code, that you want to just be providing the direction for, you know, and you have the numbers or the standards in your code, not in your plan. We also already talked about the possibility of reorganizing Title 17 just into articles and possibly looking at that so it's easier to navigate and go from one section to the other. One of the things we talked about with some of you folks before, I think, is subjective versus clear and objective standards. So, you know, I mean, an objective standard would be a building setback of 5 feet. There's no debate about what that means. Versus, you know, more subjective things about just being consistent with the character of the neighborhood, those sorts of things. And what does that mean? And this is important just for overall clarity. What's your purpose? What do you want to do? But it also plays into what kind of a review process you want to have for certain types of permits. Generally, you like to, for simple permits, you like to have clear and objective standards that your staff can review those. Everybody knows what the outcome is going to be because the standards are very clear and objective, and there's really not that much judgment involved. And that helps so that folks don't get tangled up in a subjective process just to get something fairly simple done, or a lengthy process. It costs them more money because they have to have a higher application fee because they have to do a hearing and all that kind of stuff. So that's one thing that you might want to consider as we go through when's it appropriate to use clear and objective, and when is it appropriate to use more subjective standards for certain things. And then I guess I talked about just how the standards go together with the review process that you select. Typically, the more subjective standards go to a hearing where there's more of a conversation amongst a lot of people. Well, how should we interpret this particular application? How do we apply the business case? Okay, Marcy, next slide. Back to you now.
Yeah, it's back to me now. Thank you, Keith. So I'm going to go through the form-based approach aspect of the code audit. Can everyone hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. So now I think it's clear that we're going through a big process, which is the code audit, but we are also looking at these more immediate issues, we're trying to actually come up with some potential solutions sooner for some of these immediate issues. And I just want to go through that with you. So the track, what we've been internally, and maybe you have too, been calling the track 1 amendments. You adopted some of those. There has been concern over residential development that's not in keeping with the village aesthetic. And everyone understands that this code audit process may take months or years, really, to be truthful, to get to adoptable language. That does take, it needs the time and it takes time. But in 2021, Council asked Planning Commission to consider this 2-track approach and certain amendments, so that certain amendments could be studied and adopted within this year, hopefully. And some of you remember that last joint commission in September. 4 priorities, after that meeting, 4 priorities were identified and 2 of them were adopted in January. The other 2 were held aside for further study, and we will be looking at those. So the 2 that were passed were prohibiting a combination and recombination of lots. That has the effect of limiting home sizes, and also removing the planned development overlay zone. Let me talk about the 2 track 1 amendments that were kind of held back for further study. They are limit the gross floor area ratio and lot coverage of houses, and or other solutions. But the second one that was held back was restrict gross floor area of houses in all zones. We will be bringing these forward for discussion with you, along with some other ideas. And I would like to go through some of those other ideas now. First of all, I want to let you know that I've taken a look around Cannon Beach, and really, this is not intended to point to anybody's particular house, but rather to provide a collage of what is going on historically and currently. What currently shapes development in Cannon Beach today is something that we're keenly interested in. So we're not just looking at the code, the dimensions, and we're not just discussing these future principles. We're really trying to understand, well, what literally does that result in? Why have people told us these things about being concerned about village character, being concerned about size of homes? So we're trying to see it with our own eyes and measure it and understand the code impacts. Just another collage for you to enjoy before I get into a little bit more technical information. So today, what limits and shapes development in Cannon Beach is several things in combination. And I'm going to go through these. It's a little bit pedantic, or some people enjoy it because it's geeky, but I think it's good for us all to understand the terms that are being used and exactly what they mean, because they apply very differently in combination with each other. And you have to be pretty careful about making a decision about one without understanding the interrelationship. So let's take the simplest one. It is setbacks. This is almost universal in the United States in single dwelling residential zones. That's the how close to the edge of your neighbor's property can you build your house? And it's usually side, rear, front setbacks, and they're sometimes different from each other. And then there's the building height that sets a limit to the height, and cities have different ways of measuring this, but the most typical one, which Cannon Beach subscribes to, is measuring the midpoint from to the peak, and also measuring if the house is on a slope, measuring the midpoint of the slope. You have a 24-foot height limit that typically allows 2 stories or 1.5. That is actually rather small, just for comparison with what other cities have. 35 feet tends to be a very typical height standard that you find around Oregon cities of all sizes. So I would say that 24 feet is already sort of establishing a village character. Now, I want to point out that when you combine the setbacks and the height together, you get a box shape. And in our practice, we commonly refer to this as the Jello mold. It's a pretty basic Jello mold. There's like so many square feet of house that you can fit into that Jello mold. There are other ways to shape it, though. We're going to talk about those. Another code provision that you use, which is a little bit unusual for single dwelling residential zones, is the maximum lot coverage. Not all cities use that. More and more cities are adopting it, though. And I want to mention from the top that minimum lot size has a lot to do with the size of the development. I think it's been pointed out by Caleb and Tim and CJ that the size of the lot does have quite a bit of bearing on the ultimate development capacity, even if you're not using FAR. Some cities go even further in terms of defining the lot size and defining precisely what width it must be and what depth it must be. Just want to note here, though, that these standards for lot size and lot width and depth, those don't limit how large a lot can be. They just limit how much of a lot you must have before you can put certain uses on it or certain types of houses on it. And as you know, because of the amendment that you passed in January, you've now limited to some extent the largeness of a site. So to summarize, you currently use very typical tools: the setbacks, the building height, the minimum lot size, and then you also apply the lot coverage, which is a little bit unusual, as I mentioned. So there's some additional form-based approach tools. And when I use the term form-based, I'm talking about, we think that thinking about the way that buildings fit into Cannon Beach, the way they are shaped to exemplify the village aesthetic, or the way that they interact with the landscape or with parks or the open space, the ocean front or other open spaces like parks, seems to be very big part of it needs to be a big part of our code audit, because I think people are very concerned about the shape of development and its relationship to not just to a building on a site, but an ensemble of buildings and how they work together, and how that ensemble of buildings works together at the ocean front, or how it meets the forest. These things are kind of bound up in the personality of Cannon Beach. So it's important to know exactly what we're doing when we're talking about the metrics and the dimensions. So I do want to talk about floor area ratio. It is a tool that is increasingly being used in residential zones, but it wasn't, it's really a tool that was developed for commercial areas. But some of you might be familiar with other cities in Oregon are required to amend their codes to comply with the Oregon legislature's House Bill 2001 for middle housing, which is going to make it possible to develop all kinds of other housing types in cities, not just a single dwelling detached on a lot, but cities are going to be required to permit, in addition, duplexes and cottage clusters and things like that. Now, Cannon Beach is not, it hasn't reached the population threshold to be required to do that, but you can learn a lot from the cities that are going through this process, because they're trying to address workforce housing, attainable housing, affordable housing issues by rethinking their single dwelling zoning. And we have been engaged in that process with a number of cities for the last 3 years. So we can bring that knowledge to bear. And I say that all to say that floor area ratio is becoming a tool that many cities are employing. I want to stress that it's a pretty gross tool, though. It basically sets a development capacity, but it doesn't tell you where or how or what shape that can take. That's kind of up to these other tools that we've been discussing. And I just want to point you to the diagrams at the bottom of the page here. These are all all these three versions of a mass, these are floors stacked on top of each other. They're all the same FAR. So you kind of see that if you don't have these other sculpting tools, you can have a big flat pancake or you can have a taller building and you don't know exactly where on the site that might be. But that's the role of the setbacks, the height limits, and some of these other tools. They sculpt the jello, and the FAR is kind of like the jello. It's what you get for your batter. There is this other item that's been discussed, the gross floor area, which would have an absolute number restriction on the square footage. So we're hoping to study these further, bring them back to you for more discussion, address your questions tonight. But before we get to that, some additional tools to consider might be a side yard height plane. This is an additional sculpting kind of regulation that cities use quite a bit. And it just, the standard would be the box that's defined by the setbacks and the height. But in addition, some cities are applying or have historically applied this side yard height plane or slope plane, but it requires that up above a certain height, when adjacent to the side or the rear, that the buildings either have to step back or be pulled back or slope back to avoid the tall, boxy looming that can happen on the edge of a lot. So a couple of other tools that we put in here, we're interested in talking and in hearing your ideas about more tools. A floor area ratio give back is something that cities are looking at, especially in light of the Oregon legislation for middle housing. That is limiting the size of the FAR that you get as your basic package, but letting you have more FAR if you provide another dwelling, say an accessory dwelling or a duplex or even a cluster of cottages, say. This might be a way for you to incentivize actually some of the housing some small housing or multi-generational housing that you are seeking. The lot coverage is a similar tool. It's just a lot coverage, but it applies, you get more lot coverage allowance if you provide housing, say. Easier land division for smaller lot homes is something to explore. That's something that cities are being required to do right now because of middle housing. So we have lots of examples. If you could make it simpler for somebody to divide a lot after they've built a duplex, you're not just providing more housing, you're providing more home ownership housing, which is really important if you're ultimately trying to build more housing. Another tool is the transfer of development rights. So if you are limited on the site that you are because you're in historic zone, say, there might be tools to transfer that development right to another site. So that's the list that we would propose just a starting point to talk about the principles of house size and directions that we could go. So I'm going to pull the presentation down now and open up the conversation.
And Marcy, could I just say that I think that last one, transfer development rights and some of the ones you mentioned, the tools, they can be combined. It's often what a transfer development right does, in that some of the ones we didn't mention are zoning related tools and map type changes, so that you could look more granularly at your zoning map. And so whether it's by district, your geography, whether it's by a historic type of designation, to where you're putting sizes or lot coverage or those kind of dimensional standards could be changed per district instead of simply across the board, or by R1 or R3. So you can also mix it up with that so that you have multiple ways of handling surveys or whatever you're looking at.
Exactly. When we discussed context sensitive approaches in the memo, that's what we were referring to, is mixing and matching these different tools in different areas differently. Okay. So I think
Great.
what we would like to do is hear from you about what we presented and your feedback for us.
Very good. Let's see, Robin.
Okay, one thing that Marcy, you had mentioned was the population threshold. Is that 10,000 people? Is it 5,000 or 2,500?
I mentioned the population threshold for where House Bill 2001 applies. Is that what you're talking about?
Where the ADUs would come in, that kind of thing.
Well,
You
that's,
said there was a population threshold where communities were required to do these things, but if you're under a certain population, you're not required. It's probably suggested, but not required.
yeah. I think the limit is 25,000, unless you're in the Portland metropolitan area, then you're required to do it, even if you're a tiny city. But if you're like a city in, say, Madras, we're helping Madras right now, and they're not required to do a House Bill 2001 rewrite of their single dwelling zone, but they're doing quite a bit to incorporate middle housing. They have some latitude because they're not trying to meet the legislation. Does that help?
Well, yes, and since Cannon Beach and their population has been reduced lately, it hasn't gone up. It's around 1,500.
Cities should be doing this, though. It doesn't really matter what your population is. And let's take ADUs just separately, because cities have been required by Oregon State to allow ADUs for at least 10 years now, I believe. Yeah, all cities.
Well, we currently allow ADUs.
Right.
Yes.
You're not out of compliance. You're right in there with the rest of the cities.
I encourage it.
Mhm.
And the only restriction is that it cannot be used for short-term rental. I guess there is one other, that the property owner must reside on the property that has the ADU in it.
Yeah, it might be worth just highlighting that issue for a moment. I learned a lot when I interviewed people at the beginning of this project. I interviewed about 10 people for about an hour each. And I learned a lot about housing and the problems of shortage in Cannon Beach and the ways that you have tried to deal with it over the years, and how ADUs are being used for short-term rentals in a lot of coastal cities, but Cannon Beach has specifically put in place some ways to try to get a handle on that. It's fairly unusual, though other coastal cities are not putting a limit, or they're not putting requirements on. That is something that cities can do. They still have to allow ADUs, but they can put additional conditions.
The audit will not address that in our code, I take it.
The audit,
whether the provisions we have are adequate for what the city needs.
no, the audit we would look at ADUs and the practices you have in place and preventing their use as short-term rentals.
Another question. So that would be the limit of it, or you're just throwing that out as an example? Because it seems like there might be some best known practices out there for a smaller city to adopt some zoning regulations that protect the city and enhance the ability of people to invest in these ADUs. And I'm not sure our code does that. I'm just, yeah, I'm sorry.
Well, here's how I would characterize, and correct me if I haven't gotten it right, but I think ADUs are seen, from what I understand, as a valid way to incorporate more housing into your city. But it doesn't help your housing shortage if it only provides short-term rentals. Currently, you have Right. So I think we'll want to look at the way that you control the short-term rental use of ADUs. But I guess my impression is that it's actually working pretty well for you, Cannon Beach, compared with other cities on the coast or other cities in very high demand tourist areas, and also cities of all over Oregon are suffering from this since the COVID pandemic, when people started to use short-term rentals for to live in, but not permanently.
Yeah, the challenge with the ADUs that we have is that they're not being built because the value is in the short-term rental, not in the long-term rental. And so what you have as a situation, by my perspective, is that people would rather build out into that jello mold before they would make room for the ADU, because that would fall under the gross floor area, basically. So if we had incentivized somehow a way for it to be more preferable to build smaller, but then add an ADU as a separate structure for that workforce housing need.
And might I add to that, though, it's not just building smaller, it's also serving that as a workforce housing unit. And that's something we've not done. And so we have to address workforce and not just believe that its size will dictate who's going to live there. And so one of the other things is that we found in Planning Commission and in development is that we limit to 600 square feet for an accessory dwelling unit. Doesn't always agree with an existing structure. Somebody might have an older home that where they may have 612 square feet, for instance, or 700 or something like that, and they want a little larger accessory structure. And they would like to put that as workforce housing. That currently can't be done. So is there a conditional use process or something where they might allow a larger, especially for like what Sam said, where they're really trying to do this, and we can put some kind of guarantee that that would go towards workforce housing. I really think those are some areas that keep coming up at Planning Commission, DRB, other things like that.
Yeah, thank you. That we will include those, looking at those issues. Can I just ask for a protocol? I can't actually tell who's speaking unless you tell me.
Well, let me, this is Mike. Just an anecdotal information, and I can't point to specific, but I am aware of a property owner with an ADU being restricted from renting the ADU short-term, moved into their ADU so they could rent their big house in the short-term market. The only way to find a way around the rules. So as you look at that, think about that particular, that just violated and avoided the whole effort to provide long-term rental property in exchange for short-term.
Yeah, thank you. Should I be calling on people, or is there someone else
I'll do
that
it.
wants to?
I'll do it when I see them. And I do see Lisa. Go ahead, Lisa.
Oh, okay. One of the things that I saw that you mentioned was that the lot coverage is unusual, restricting lot coverage, or that all towns don't do that. The amount of lot coverage, they just do the FAR, but not lot coverage. And I think that whatever solution that we come up with, we have to have a combination of both. I think one without the other won't work. I think we have to, I love the fact that we have a lot coverage ratio and as well as FAR. And I think that needs to be maintained, especially considering the fact that, we call ourselves a tree city. And so we want to maintain as many trees as we can. And just in general for environmental protection, less lot coverage or limiting lot coverage is very important. Is that why a lot of other cities are adopting it?
Let me make a correction, or actually be more precise. I failed to say this earlier. A lot of cities don't use FAR, they use lot coverage, but still lot coverage is somewhat rare. I think FAR is even rarer. A lot of cities are adopting lot coverage now instead of FAR, because FAR is kind of complicated and it's very abstract. And actually lot coverage can do a lot of things that FAR can do. It still operates as a percentage of the lot. So it increases if the lot increases, et cetera. But it can do a lot to limit the overall development of a site, or to preserve, like you're saying, Lisa, place for trees, and to preserve that relationship between the house and the yard.
Let me also add to Lisa's comment in the fact that our lot coverage where we define open space is also broken down into hard open space and soft. That was very specific so that people wouldn't just cover blacktop everything, so that we did have more green space in the landscaping. So that's a very important aspect, I think.
I agree, yeah.
And I would just say that's going back to someone who deals with the language, having that different in the DRB and commercial areas than at least what's termed hardscapes and softscape, as different than what is actually in the residential areas and single family. Because lot coverage, let me just read you one of the 5 things of lot coverage. And if you guys can make sense of it, this is what we deal with. I've never, I've worked in many areas as well, looked at many codes, going through many code revisions, but they say number 4, that portion of the area of decks less than 30 inches in height above the existing grade, patios, courtyards, and gravelled and paved areas other than designated off-street parking, which exceeds 25% of the allowed lot coverage, and then it goes on to number 5. If you can follow that sentence, you win a prize. But anyhow, what it speaks to is that I think a lot of people say we've got 50% lot coverage, but no, you're getting credit for an extra, for 5,000 square foot lot, an extra 300 square feet. So you're really coming to about a 56% lot coverage for a 5,000 square foot lot because of this provision for that one sentence. And so, and it goes into more details that kind of conflict and change, and they're different than what's in the DRB and in the commercial areas. So that's my wish list. If I had my Sears catalog come in for the wish book, that would be the first on the list, kind of straighten that language out, the definitions. I think I see Clay smiling because he knows that I've talked with him about it over the past couple of years. And these are the kind of things that really will do us a lot and make it a lot simpler, a lot easier, just to make it simpler language for people to understand.
Clay, go ahead.
I don't know if this is a perfect segue off what you just said, but maybe. One of Mr. Hughes said he was trying to get a handle on what started the conversation around housing size, and it's obviously got a lot of components to it. We've talked about workforce housing, but it seems like one of the things that I learned through the process of some of the houses that we heard about, where scale or how they fit into the neighborhood, was it doesn't seem, and maybe, again, I don't have a lot of experience with that process, but it doesn't seem like our design review board has a lot of input on the residential side. I would be curious to hear from you, Marcy, what you see in other jurisdictions relative to the way a planning commission, design review board, and council play together. Specifically, though, that design review board and how they might play into our code. While there's more components to the piece about the scale of housing, I think how it fits into a neighborhood is important. And my hunch is that maybe if we had, if we gave the design review board more power there, or brought them into that conversation more often, maybe some of the issues that we're challenged with would be addressed. But can you speak to how a design review might address some of the things, design review
Sure.
board might address some of these things?
First of all, I don't think it's a good idea to incorporate more onerous design review in housing, especially when you're suffering from a housing shortage. But what you do want is clear and objective language, kind of like what Keith was saying, cleaning up the things like Jeff was saying, the language. So it's really clear and it's easy to meet, and set it out in development standards, whether it's FAR or lot coverage or whatever you use. At the point that those recommendations about fixing your clear and objective language are put forward, the design review board has a very significant role to play there. They should be helping you understand whether that package of amendments is adequate, is really going to produce the good built results. But I don't think that, I wouldn't recommend that every house be subject to design review. So I hope that distinction is clear. I think the design review board has a very important role to play in creating the legislation. But I do think that after that is done, that it should be possible for a house to be permitted without a design review procedure.
Alicia.
Well, I'm wondering about that because can you put, I mean, are you going to start saying what colors houses can, and there's a house in Cannon Beach that a lot of people are not happy about. And we hear about it all the time. And I've heard so many complaints about it. And how did this get through? And it followed the code, and it's across from the church downtown. It's I guess a purple house, sort of shiny purple house. And a lot of people are upset about it. If you don't have a design review involved in residential housing, can you actually write a code saying, well, you can't make a purple house, or you can't make a shiny surface on your house? I mean, then it almost starts to sound like weird covenants of some sort. I don't know how you control that kind of thing, an eyesore that people driving in, I mean, visitors talk about it. How did that get built here? Or do we care? Can people, put shiny purple houses wherever they want?
I want to say that I think a principle at work here is that if you're going to go forward and increase housing, and you want to increase housing types, you want to encourage ADUs, and you want to maybe even encourage some of these other housing types like duplexes, where the new unit is the same size as the old unit, it's not limited, or you want to create a cottage cluster, say, that those should not be penalized. They should not have additional design standards placed on them that you would not place on a single dwelling house. You should treat all this housing kind of in a democratic way. And that's a principle I think is worth sticking to. That said, if you wanted to, you could say, you could have language in your clear and objective standards for all houses, no purple houses. I mean, but I do think there's a point at which you have to say, what is the larger goal here? Does that matter more than housing?
Could you let Michelle, she was wanting to speak.
So is Mike. So let's go with Mike.
Sorry, Michelle.
That's okay.
Okay.
Well, I had a question and a comment. Well, you keep saying there's a housing shortage. And I'm not really first of all, I didn't know why design review is in a housing thing, because but apparently they're rethinking of that. But the housing shortage, I feel like we don't really have a housing shortage. We just have a shortage of people actually using their houses. So there's actually plenty of houses per how many people live here. And so I don't really understand that terminology. And I also really appreciate you said a word that I hadn't heard before, which is attainable housing. And everybody keeps saying workforce housing. And to me, that has a little Downton Abbey feeling to it, where there should be attainable housing for everybody, like not just the person that's slicing your bagel or the person that's mowing your lawn, but the attainable housing. I really like that. And I really would like to encourage other people to use that. So that's basically, but I'm curious about the housing shortage, if that's actually, we have a housing shortage?
Yes, I do believe you have a housing shortage. I think all the cities in the United States actually at this point have a housing shortage. I mean, we've gone through a huge population change post-recession. If you remember the recession, nobody built any housing during a period that basically went on for about a decade. There's a nationwide housing shortage, and Cannon Beach is not immune from that. You have your own unique version of a housing shortage. It is that people who work in Cannon Beach or work anywhere on the coast can't really afford to live in Cannon Beach. There may be a house available, but it's not affordable or attainable. So I would characterize that as a housing shortage.
So you're saying like different than, say, Portland, where there's not actually enough housing and there's a lot of people, as opposed to there's a lot of housing and not a lot of people here, but it's just not affordable.
Yeah, although I got the sense from talking to people that and maybe it's the issue that you're describing. There's a lot of housing, it's just not available for housing. It's being used for short-term rental, or it's being used for, it's not available.
And yeah, just like the fact that there's 1,500 residents and so many houses. That's what I was like.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point and a nice definition for it. So thank you for that. Mike?
Yeah, I want to go back to the design review or design requirements on single-family homes. Saying that there's no restrictions whatsoever, got to be democratic for everyone. I envision with that liberal interpretation and the high cost of construction, we'll end up putting up concrete block houses. We'll put up flat slab houses. We'll put up adobe flat roof houses. We'll put up all brick New England style houses, and none of those fit within the character of Cannon Beach. I think if you put some standards in there about siding, materials, stone, shingles, blackboard, it's got to be something besides, I'm going to build the cheapest house I can on as much space as I can. And the best way to do it is concrete block. They do it in Florida all the time.
I agree with that completely.
Yes, I need to make a correction. I wasn't saying there should not be any development standards. But do you want to prohibit certain colors of paint? That clearly Cannon Beach has a character they want to maintain. My principle is more about applying that fairly to all, whatever it is that you decide to do or continue to do. The Cannon Beach aesthetic, apply that, but apply it to all housing equally. Don't apply it to more harshly to a kind of a newer type of housing like an ADU. That is very typical. That type of approach was used a lot in the 80s and 90s to prohibit more workforce housing from going in. They would apply much more stringent, really unmeetable development standards to say apartments. And I'm just saying that's a principle we should be trying to get away from.
It also sounds like, to me, I appreciate the discussion, and focusing on ADU is a good way to discuss the idea. But I think right now, in this very early state that we're in, I think we should be discussing more about the policy in general that the community wants to put forward. My focus is the comprehensive plan and getting that clearer and hammer it out first, because that will help define the whole Purple House issue. Before we get into the weeds about which qualifications we want, we need to kind of have a better idea what that definition was that Keith mentioned about how to understand what village character means. I know there's, just from the letters that we've been getting, not just for tonight's meeting, but for several meetings on various topics, not just this topic, that village character is defined differently by every person in the community, because it is a personal choice. At some point, we have to characterize it as a community choice. My belief, because I know who wrote this, document, especially the comp plan. I know the folks who did that. Most of them are passed or gone, but I know what they meant, or at least I have a feeling I know what they meant. So when I look at the comp plan, I look at it with 1984 goggles, because I have to think of the fact that, okay, now we are 34 years since this thing was literally initiated in its most current form. There's been some tweaking here and there, but nothing dramatic. So I guess that's where I think we should be really delving into. And I really appreciate your comment about us sending you information, because it's a little easier for everybody to translate. And then we can really develop it into another discussion in the group. I'm ranting again, so I guess that's just where I'm.
I think it's a good point, Sam, but there's also another issue out there. And I've just been to one planning commission meeting as a member and a couple others when issues have come up. We see beachfront erosion in every planning commission meeting, and we're handling them one by one, case by case. And I'm not sure anybody in this community's looked at the problems that are coming down the road in a few years and tried to figure out how we might get a step ahead of it. And I'm not sure either that this is Mike. Hi. Geez, I lost my train of thought on that. Anyway, I'd like us to get ahead of that. I'm not sure the solutions that come in. I mean, one dumping sand over here, two doing berms over here, another person putting rocks is anything but a quick fix for a problem that's going to get worse as we go along. And I guess what I was going to ask is that within the scope of this? Because I have no idea.
I'll let the professionals respond, but I believe it is because of the statewide goals. And in the statewide goals, there's what, 4, Jeff, that refer directly to ocean management?
I'm not the statewide goals professional. Yeah, there's at least 2.
They're in here.
Yeah, goal 18 is in there for sure. We do it. It will be addressed if it's touched on part of the 18 goals.
Yeah, and it's also in the zoning language, so it's part of Title 17. So
the last question I have, Jeff, and this is for you because I think Pete, what your name is, I'm sorry.
Keith Light.
I'm sorry, Keith, you invited us all to contact you if we have comments or questions. And I'm not sure, Jeff, that's how you want to, if you're managing the relationship.
That's always, and anytime you can always send it to planning@CI Cannon Beach, if you don't want to send it to anyone else. But we'll put that out and we'll get a web page dedicated just to the code audit with these materials, and we'll have that as the link to mail things to.
Okay. And then just logistically, I look for the package on the planning commission side. I didn't know where to go for this. Where is this under city council? Is that where we're at?
Yeah.
It's a city council meeting that has planning and DRB, so this is unusual.
Okay.
But we will have a dedicated page to this.
Okay, thanks.
Since there's a lull, I will have another question about the form-based Jello mold. I like that reference because it kind of looks like it. A long time ago, I remember a discussion about something very similar to this, and I believe this was a discussion for a design review and how they were handling for the commercial end of things. But it could relate to this, was a front and backyard average line so that a designer could go like this with their face of the building. And then they would run into an averaging system so that the Jello mold would start getting a little more design oriented rather than a square box. That kind of relates to the height edge lot picture where the sides would have a different aspect. But we also talked about, I believe we were referencing some other location. I'm thinking Breckenridge or someplace like that, that had a second story and a third story different Jello mold on top. So I'm just kind of referring this to folks that this is really pliable, the form-based approach. Get into details.
Yeah, I'll just respond quickly that what we hope to do through this process is come up with some specific sculpting tools that would apply to the Jello mold, whether it's what you're describing, like it sounds like you're describing on the top level of a house or top level of a building being stepped back from the edge to diminish its bulk, perhaps, or along the front lot line where you're drawing a line between the two adjacent houses and creating a middle line where the front of that house can go. Those are all things that we can discuss along with the other things like the Jello mold itself or the FAR, the lot coverage.
I think another perfect example as a reference point for some of what you just discussed, where form-based code can help. Even in a recent example is the North Avenue pot shop or the North End pot shop, that where the parking is in the front and the building is in the back. If that had a build to line, as is what Sam I think is mentioning here, where you have a front setback where you can build two, and then the one that you can't go further back, and then the parking in the rear, which is what most form-based code is. Then you have this, you're putting that form, that Jello mold in a, like you said, a range of area, but it's still within an area where you want that building. And so the open space, the softscape and all that would go in the other areas. So you're not just by moving that Jello mode, you're also moving what would be the softscape mode, because you're placing that on the property as well. So I think you can see how powerful these kind of tools can be if they're handled properly. And that goes to what I think Marcy was saying. These are objective standards. You're not willy-nilly subjectively like design guidelines do, where you're saying, all these kind of scale and character and things. No one, there's never defined, but these things give you objective standards, and you can still say, hey, you can have a color palette of 12 colors. You can do that. You can have certain shapes within that you prefer, but you can go to that level of detail, or you can pull back and just stick with the Jello modes in the correct places. So
anybody else can jump in here, but I would like to also address the color concept. As being trained as a designer, I push back really strongly on surfacing and color, because especially when I was on design review for the fact that it can be done nicely. I was riding my bike and there's a little tiny house over on Madison or something. It's purple. It's great. That would not be able to be allowed if you said no. The problem in the sense that I think we ran into is the freedom of a homeowner to do what they think is attractive compared to what the community thinks is attractive. And that's a hard area to navigate.
Sam, isn't that just the equivalent of color palettes that put in CCNRs in large communities? You have a development, you say, you can paint your house these 5 colors. People buy into it all the time.
I wouldn't.
Well, then you wouldn't buy into that development, right? But that's your choice.
Yeah, that again, it becomes a bit of a challenge.
I know. I have a kind of a philosophical objection to it too, but Purple House is a mess, right? This one down here anyway. So, but it's got bigger problems than its color.
That's the thing. That one has bigger problems than just the color. My sense is I would go back to the DRB potential for residential. And we talked about this in the fact that when you get to a certain size, it kicks in. Because size is what we're having troubles with when it's painted all one color, whatever color.
Well, just on that point, just to get back to, I think what Marcy was bringing up with process and being democratic, you can have a balance of that where you say, these are the acceptable colors. If you want something different, you come before the design review board. So there's ways of handling this where you get the community's desires. And if they want to do something different, it still has community approval ability. And so, I think that there's ways to go about that. And that's why we've got Marcy and Keith to kind of help us through navigate some of these tougher choices.
Yeah.
My feeling on, and it's hard to even say this out loud, but after whatever it is now, 3 years on the planning commission, my feeling of a democratic process is if we don't pretty tightly regulate what we believe our town, what we want it to look like, and maybe this is the time where we have to reset that with this group. Democratic means who's got the biggest attorney, and they're going to interpret that code the way they want. We're never going to get it right. We have to have tighter standards, or we're going to always be having Kabisman help us through these multitude of attacks. So I think it is important to pin that down as much as we can with the agreement of this body. And here's a representation of our town and what we think is important to values today. The size of the home has changed from 1970 to where we are today, what that should look like. What people can afford, that's changed. We need to consider that. But I do think we need to think about regulating as much as we can, or we're just going to continually be dealing with attorneys interpreting the code they want. We'll never get that right.
Good point.
So Sam, I thought your point was a good one. We have a number of issues in front of us. The biggest one probably is house size. From our first meeting on this to the planning commission to back to you, I could have said we were in 3 separate conversations. So I think it's good we're here tonight. Maybe we want to hit that one again. How do we feel about
that?
I don't mind. This is important.
Yeah,
it's hugely important. I mean, we've got a lot of feedback. And it sets the tone for what does village character mean.
Anybody else? House size?
I'd be happy to weigh in a little bit. I am new to the process, but as I entered the process, it was right as the FAR discussion was just going haywire, right? So I don't have any history with the decisions that have been made. Certainly Marcy even brought up more tools than we've already heard a conversation about. So I feel as though there are many, many tools available to us that would allow people the freedom that it sounds like most of the constituents want, while also maintaining some level of control without needing to put hard numbers on it. For some reason, the hard number is going to be a trigger point no matter where we set it, even if it's really high. So it sounds to me like we need to really sculpt. I also do have to wonder when people say village feel, I am guessing the absolute size of the house is somewhat related to the impression the house makes from the outside. So if it's a huge box that is in one bright color, that is all flat sides, I think that that feels really big and feels to someone looking at it much bigger than perhaps a house of the same size that is in the more traditional Cannon Beach architecture, for instance. So I'm wondering whether some of what we are hearing about concern about size has to do with architecture too. And so I think that we need to have an architecture conversation along with a size conversation when we're trying to capture those who are worried about village feel. Just my 2 cents.
Very good. Lisa?
Well, I think the cap on size, I don't think anyone is married to that idea. It was just a suggestion of a way to control giant houses in Cannon Beach, because, you know, trying to tie size limitations to the concept of families, encouraging families in Cannon Beach, is a false parallel, because very few families who are going to build in Cannon Beach can afford a huge mansion to house their families. It's usually wealthy second homeowners who build these giant houses. And I don't, 3,500 plus square foot houses. I mean, I don't think that, and then they're empty for, most of the year, a lot of them are. So I think that that is the thing that people are disturbed about. I don't think, and I know there's been tons of letters written by one group of people that protect the Cannon Beach group, but there's also lots of other people I talk to all the time who are concerned about house size, even though they don't articulate it with letters and they haven't formed a cohesive group to address it. So I think that, tying house size to ADUs is also a false parallel. You can have you can have a small house or a normal size house and still have an ADU for long-term rental. So, which would bring in extra income as well for the middle homeowner. So I don't think that if there's a way to limit it without having a cap on square footage, that's fine. It's the end result that I'm interested in seeing. I'm not married to any particular way to get to that result.
Thank you. I really appreciate Mickey's comment on the fact that I agree totally that what the community sees as a building, a structure, it's not the living space, it's not the garage, it's not what is defined within the structure, it's what we see. That is to some people disturbing, or to other people appreciative. Depends on what it is you're seeing. I can reference houses that I like that other people would probably argue with. That's fine. That's what we're doing. But size tends to be the one item, whatever you see is the one item that is always, and it has been. And when you go back and look at the comp plan, it's even mentioned there. So they knew about it back then. So size has always been part of our attention that we're trying to keep within the community. That balance that the comp plan constantly refers to. So, right.
Landscaping can also have a huge impact on your perception of the cottage or the massive building. If it's just a bare-faced square building, it looks much larger than if it's one that has some angles to it, some right angles, some setbacks, some protrusions with a sloped roof and nice plantings and picket fence in front with landscaping out to the shoulder. instead of just gravel, it can change that whole perception. Nobody wants sidewalks with that's not what we're looking for. But I think, and everybody, most people like gravel streets. But I think if there's some requirement in these areas to have landscaping up to a point, not just behind the fence or behind their property line, but actually out in front. It would do a lot to change that perception that we're starting to see, partly because we're seeing the new houses, they're bigger houses, and they are just bare-faced buildings. Over time, maybe some of that landscaping will develop, but I think that's something else that needs to be taken a look at as we try to define what is this village feel. We're not going to have English cottages. We do have some, and they're fantastic, but we can't dictate that everybody build a small little English cottage with ivy and flowers and stuff. But we can soften it up. And so the color of the paint's not so objectionable. Maybe it becomes actually attractive because it fits within the landscaping. So I just don't want to lose sight of that as we continue to talk about building size. There's also the building shape, and then there's the landscaping that goes around it, in front of it, and the preservation of trees. We don't want to forget about that. I've always been told, well, you can cut down a tree if the building has been approved, because the building gets priority. I think we need something that says you can't build this box right here because there's beautiful spruce tree. And there'll be some requirement to build around or adjacent to some of those trees. That becomes part of the landscape. It also changes the shapes of the building so they're not so massive looking. That might mean you got to have more leeway in the setback requirement. So there's a lot to be addressed here, but we're trying to get away from this big, ugly square box look that we're starting to see more and more of.
Amen to that.
One way to, Jeff, you'd mentioned this before, one way to protect what I think many of us would associate with village character are those small bungalows that were, I think they were timber and fishing shacks for years. Maybe we look at either, we've talked about this before, historic districts, or maybe the properties are named individually as historic and give the owner some, there should be a benefit to them in some way, so that there's not the perception that there's value being taken. Maybe they are given the right to sell their FAR or something, but there are some areas and certainly individual properties that we have to look at that way to protect some of those structures that are a part of what we think of as making up this village.
Yeah, I definitely think that most people see the presidentials as an area that's unique for capturing a lot of those cottages that are.
And aren't a lot of those lots about 5,000 feet?
Yeah, they're all within 5,000. 4,800 to 5,000, and so. I think that they're one of the ones that are most at risk right now, and we're seeing some loss in those. And so, some type of transfer development right, or whether it's, floor area ratios or whatever, that gives those people ability to, some, like you said, some kind of bonus for keeping it at that way. So those are some of the programs that work elsewhere. And so, we can look at various programs in Aspen and some of the mountain communities and Key West and other areas. They have those kind of programs.
Is there a regulation here on demolitions? I mean, how does a demolition get approved here?
Pretty much, we don't have
rubber stamp, right?
Yeah, because you'll see those demolition mainly in historic districts where I work with a few of those demolition provisions.
But you were just talking about the presidentials, right? I mean, why not treat them like trees? If you cut them down, you got to pay a little fee just to reimburse the community for the loss of value in that structure. Why not?
What I do?
The idea of floor area ratio, to me, is when you talk about the fact that a large percentage of our, and I know Tim gave us a bunch of numbers and I don't have it memorized, but a large percentage of our properties are the 5,000 square foot lots. In a sense, that makes the floor area ratio a cap. Because it's just a number that says this is as big as you can go in that size of a lot. It is good for the larger lots because it gives you a little extra. And it balances when you get to the smaller lots. So in a sense, it's the same thing as saying 2,000 square foot or 3,000 square foot or 4,000 square foot, whatever number you pick when you're looking at a 5,000 square foot majority. I just want to say the floor area ratio keeps tossed out all the time as something different. It's not. It's a cap in itself.
Exactly. And that's, it is the, and Mr. Ramey's Palo Alto, I think he brought that. When I put the little matrix table is a very similar type of concept, except his, like Palo Alto's, it's a cumulative thing. So that first 5,000 feet or 10,000, whatever you choose, it's at 0.5. Then any additional, they add that extra 0.2 cap, which really knocks it down. So you're getting more of what I think Mike has talked about, a curve type of approach to floor area ratio that really caps anything over that threshold or that limit. And so you're getting a little bit more with if you buy a property. But when we got rid of the lot combinations, we pretty much stopped a lot of that ability. So yeah, we're stuck with, like you said, maybe 15% of your properties are over that limit, but they're only going to be able to build to that 0.2 for that extra square.
I would love to find, hang on a second, Lisa. I would love to find a way, if somebody out there has done something that could incentivize or make it beneficial for a builder to build smaller, rather than saying, this is the maximum you can build, this is the bubble that you get to build in, you're done. You know, most developers are going to say, okay, that's my max, that's fine, that's what I'm going to build to. Why not say, how can you improve and make quality smaller rather than just, this is your limit? Lisa?
No, I think you'd have to change human nature to do that, but that, yeah, I mean, really, I don't think. Now that chart that you were talking about, Jeff, my question on that is the one with, with the FAR caps and then the extra 2% or extra percentage for larger lots. Is that also, does lot coverage play into that at all? How do the two interface?
You can, I mean, you can do a similar approach to lot coverage where, you do a tiered approach to lot coverage where any additional square footage you can do just like, I think Mr. Ramey had suggested 0.5 for the size for the first 5,000 square foot. And then anything more, you can do the same either with, they're both ratios. And so you could choose to do both in similar.
The Palo Alto model did not have anything about lot coverage in it.
Well, you can still do it with lot coverage. And in fact, like Marcy said, some choose to do it with just one, right? We are in residential districts. And so if you put a limit of whether it's the floor area ratio or lot coverage, you're limiting both of those, especially when you have a building height limit of 24 feet. You're capping what you can build to because you're not going to be able to put 7-foot floors in. So
I understand that, but I'm just saying is that model, that Palo Alto model to me was lacking in that aspect of lot coverage. If it was combined with lot coverage, then that model, might work.
Yeah, I agree. I think that is that's,
Not sufficient as it is at all, as far as I'm concerned.
I think it's kind of close to what I gave you, Jeff, a couple of weeks ago.
yeah. And until we have a new definition of lot coverage, I'm not gonna, I'm with Lisa. It's not gonna satisfy me.
Jeff, well,
Where do we go from here then?
Clay, did you have?
just a quick, could you talk about how transferring development rights might add more affordable housing in Cannon Beach? So I've got a 900-foot house in the presidential streets. It has FAR rights that I can sell off. How might that affect, or maybe Marcy, you've seen how this might play out. How might the sale of those FAR, let's call them credits, help add more affordable housing to Cannon Beach? Is there a way to tie those two together?
I honestly, I don't, it's not usually used as a way to get more affordable housing. It gets more to what Sam is saying, where you build better, smaller homes, because if, like if you're wanting to save that historic cottage and you want to fix it up and put more money into it, you can sell off your rights for that other floor area ratio or however you want to do square footage to someone else. And so that money you can invest in your historic cottage and keep that and get some bang for the buck. Now, as
So then
far
who is your buyer for the rights?
it's either you have sending zone and receiving zones. And so wherever you're wanting to put, it's often in mixed use areas or where you're wanting to put more density, or if you just have a floor area ratio where someone can bump their floor area ratio by a percentage or, a 10% jump, they can do that if they buy a trend that can be a receiving zone. So there's a way to get more density through that method.
Do you set up an exchange for something like that? How does that?
It's an exchange.
Okay.
So
Is there an area of town that this group of people would believe that the area would be okay with us suggesting we want to add density to this section of town, whether it's maybe low density already or on the fringe? I don't know, where there might be that receiving zone that we could encourage more development in by, one, protecting historic properties by incentivizing them to sell them, and then creating a market for them to sell into.
And like I said, Clay, it doesn't have to be a density in more units. It can be in more square footage to allow someone to build a little bit bigger than, to up to 600 extra square feet.
Well, yeah, I get that, but one of the challenges we're having here is workforce housing has come up so many times. I'm trying to tie something into more housing that people who are working in the restaurants and the service industry, or this is their only home, not their second home, can afford. If we are able to create zones like that, we will create more affordable housing, protect some of the housing that we consider to help create this village feel. And maybe we don't have to touch on the bigger picture so much of the size of houses. I don't think we want to make bigger houses. I think we want to make more houses and more affordable houses. And so I'm trying to see if there's a way to create a capitalistic system to drive that.
I think we should explore this issue further and come back to you with the considerations that you've raised. One of them being, like, where would the density go? I mean, I think that's going to be kind of a big issue for Cannon Beach. So maybe we can bring back how it might work and some of the key considerations or issues, I should say.
That'd be great.
Well, while I have the mic though, I just want to point out that there were a couple of other things on that slide along with the transfer of development rights as the give back, the give back programs. One was the FAR give back and the lot coverage give back. And I just want to explain those a little bit more, because those are real solutions that some cities are enacting today that you can kind of borrow their lessons. If you were to do like was originally mentioned by Tim in Palo Alto, say that your base FAR is set at 6. And you get that for one dwelling. However, if you say, wait, I'm going to build an ADU, or I'm going to build a duplex, or I'm going to add a few cottages to my lot, then you could actually get an additional FAR to do that. But otherwise you're capped, like you're only allowed this one amount of FAR. But if you do more dwellings, then you're allowed more. This has been written into the Portland code to encourage more middle housing. Now, you could do the same thing with lot coverage, where you offer more lot coverage. You're limited at 35%, say, but you get an additional 10% if you do an ADU, or you do an ADU that's all on one level. That's something that the city of Milwaukee has just instituted. So these are ways you could incentivize by basically you're capping what you get, but you're adding back again for the things that you want, what the city wants.
And I will note that was in our track 1 changes suggestions, that's what's in there.
Something, yeah, something. So I have a little pushback with that, because what you're doing is granting what you don't want or something else that you do want. To me, it's not a fair balance. I would almost try and figure out a way that you were allowed to do an ADU as a reward for building smaller. Figure that out. I don't know how you do that objectively, but that would make more sense to me.
Can I bring up, sorry.
Go ahead. No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I know in Berkeley, building permits for ADUs have to be approved. So I know that some individuals decide that they're going to have an ADU and then they use it for personal use. It's just an extra space in their home or an office. So I love the idea of workforce housing and ADUs, but is there a way to very carefully ensure that that unit is actually put into the long-term rental market? Because as long as we're quote unquote incentivizing anything in terms of making your house smaller, if we're not careful, people will say, that's fine, my house is going to be smaller because I'm going to use this extra space over here for my quote unquote ADU. So I really want us to be sure that we think carefully about how we ensure every ADU that is built actually gets used for workforce housing.
Yeah, I think you can do that, Mickey. And yes, I'm happy to, like Marcy says, we'll be happy to bring that model to you and how to do that.
It would be in the deed, correct?
Excuse me?
It would be in the deed.
I've seen that in with deed restrictions for affordable housing for 99 years or something like that. In exchange for 99 years, we give you the ability to build another unit or more unit.
And then do you have an enforcement officer run around and make sure that they're doing it? I mean, how do you regulate that?
No, what most jurisdictions do, you have a workforce housing program that is either run by the housing authority or planning office. And to be able to rent one of those, you have to enlist in the program. And so you meet certain qualifications. And in most jurisdictions, they're ranked by the community on which whether it's police officers, public works, whoever, they get certain points. And each year they work, they gain more points. And so they move up the list. And so when a unit comes available, they have a first right to, person gets to go first. They can take it or not, and goes down the list.
At least this point's a good one. How do you enforce it? You're gonna have the city suing citizens if they don't use their additional square footage to.
They sign up for the program and they can only do it through that housing authority.
Right, but at the end of the day, if they put, well, I'm not gonna say that. I was gonna get political and I'm not gonna do that. If they say, okay, fine, change my mind, what are you gonna do?
Well, it's deed restricted, so they can't,
Somebody's got to enforce it to make that deed restriction.
Everyone has to enforce every program. That's what this is about. This is a government. We have
Oh,
to.
no, I get that. I
get
get that. But giving them a permit and saying, have at it, you have some recourse. Can you adjust these as things go along?
It's up to each jurisdiction to develop that.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's not one size fits all. So that's part of this. So that's part of the process, developing those. I have to deal with that every day. We have so many, for a small jurisdiction, we have a lot that we have to oversee. And
I get it. I know
each of these code changes will affect what I can do. And like you said, whether we enforce, we have that discussion, was it yesterday at the short-term rental task force? You know, it's everything that is legislated, somebody's got to enforce it.
I know, but you know what? You know, just with short-term rentals, people abuse that all the time and nobody catches them. So what are you going to do if somebody decides, hey, you know, say to you, it'd be great for like an office?
Well, I think that, you know, I like to hear that, but I prefer seeing a true complaint and then we can follow up on it and report that and track it. And we have caught them and we have recouped value on.
Okay, if you've got a mechanism to get value out of them,
No, so
it doesn't involve going to court every time somebody.
it doesn't every time, but yes, you sometimes have to go to court.
Okay.
So
it seems like with a program like you described, somebody builds their ADU, it's in their deed, it's going to be for workforce housing, we use that term. Then there's a program manager and there's people on the list. My name comes up, okay, I want it. And you go there and they're using it for an office. They got to get out. It's in their deed. It's got to be used. It's got to be rented to this workforce housing group. So it's a program. They can't just say, I'm building an ADU and trust me, it's going to be a program that has a pool of applicants. And when they need a place, that's where they go.
No, when I was reading about those ADUs, I hate to bring it up right now, but Jeff, you were saying it's more like multifamily housing. It's not conveniences or whatever you call them in a big house.
What
do you call those little mother-in-law quarter, whatever?
Grandmother.
Yeah.
That's one thing I was going to bring up was the fact that an ADU, the definition of an ADU is not just a separate small cabin. It's also grandmother apartments, basement apartments, weird attachments to other homes. So it is a bigger complex issue than, because it could increase the size of a building again. We're running back into that. The other thing that I wanted to bring up was, in our case, the majority, I would believe, of our residential buildings are second homes and short-term rentals.
Now, second homes.
I know, but combine those.
Yeah, 200, I can give you the exact number, 200 short-term rentals. And the majority, I would say it's, I'll bring that chart next time, but the majority, 4 or 5 times the amount of short-term rentals are second homes.
Yeah, and my point is that they are the most unlikely to want to have an ADU on their property. Because you don't want a renter when you've got company coming, or when the family's coming, or when you're trying to rent it out for $1,400 a weekend. So that automatically cuts out a large chunk of our housing capability. With that, we're trying to get the idea of an ADU involved. So ADUs are literally a small percentage of what could happen. Nancy brought up, where do we go from here?
Yeah, because we talk about lot coverage and we talk about FAR, but I want to see information that you have. I want to see the graphs. I want to see what exactly that you're talking about, so we can kind of start judging what it is we really want.
Sure.
Well, we can talk about it all we want to, but unless we have something concrete to look at, we really can't make any decisions.
Right. And so for next steps, there definitely seems to be interest in still the track 2 on house sizes. One that was left off, the second element of that, I think it's truly 5 things. The 5th is that non-conforming thing that if you're going to cap anything or put limits on, how do we treat non-conforming structures that may be put into? So that's a little bit of the language that we'll also probably need to address if we continue along that track 2 path. But it seems to me that that's part of the next discussion. But I think you could also have the workforce housing as an ADU concept as part of that, because you're looking at accessory units, those kind of size limitations, and then what Clay had gotten into about, well, what about the ADU and other programs that do these kind of things. So we'll bring that back as well for Mike to answer, how do you enforce them and how does it work with that kind of program?
Thank you, John.
And so then the second thing that will have to happen is, but how does this fit into the larger process? My feeling is that you guys would like to meet one more time jointly to talk about those track 2 things. And then the process, of course, is whatever we come up with, then goes through the Planning Commission, goes through all of the hearing stages of the Planning Commission, then to the City Council. So, we go back to, in other words, step 1 as far as the legislation process goes. So we go back to public hearings and input, probably a workshop at the public Planning Commission. What I will also do is to talk about, some of those that have remained quiet tonight, and I won't mention names, but I will have on my DRB agenda and my Planning Commission agenda this month, time for those that may not have wanted to speak conjointly, but we can talk about those. How is the DRB working right now, Planning Commission? And I know that many members have come to me and voiced opinions in recent past, so that we can also, I can always contact me at planning and I'll put that, or we'll get a dedicated page to, but that will also continue that discussion at those individual levels, so that when we do come back as a joint on this track 2, we'll also be able to have a more informed from those levels as well.
If I may, I feel like there's a step before this, and that is the policy, the vision and the comprehensive plan, and get a little more clear. There is some language in there that I think is really good, but there's also some in there that's confusing as all get out and either out of date. I think we need to cover some of those bases before we get into specifics about housing policies or ADUs or something like that, just because that would help us define when we talk about the other ones.
Sam, I said that 3 years ago.
I know.
So I'm so happy to hear that. But we will, definitely will take that into account. And I know that Keith brought up the comprehensive plan and the review of that. We can definitely fit that in as well.
But I guess what I would be suggesting is that those of us who are willing to go through the comp and provide them with input, and then we have a joint meeting where we just discuss that input. Because you're going to compile a bunch of stuff and we're going to all say different things. And so figuring out what those are will really help us when we get to the more weedy stuff.
Sounds good. Marcy, any thoughts?
I feel that we can do both of those things, look at some specific scenarios for an ADU for workforce housing, for example, or the transfer of development rights and how that would work. And also look at how do you define village character in clear and objective language in the zoning code.
Excellent.
At that, we're just a little after 2 hours, so perfect timing for me. Anybody else have anything you want to add, and inject before we move on? Okay. Thank you, guys. This has been really intriguing, and I just want to mention again to the audience that's out in the Zoom land, this is a long and continuous process, so stay tuned. Do we do a good of the order for this meeting?
We do have it on the agenda.
Yes, we need to do a good of the order. Anybody have anything for good of the order? Nope. Okay, we are adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Right.